While across the nation, typically quiet school board meetings have turned hostile. In some cases, people get violent over hot-button political issues like critical race theory, book bans, and mask mandates. A nationwide group of suburban women called Red, Wine, and Blue are working to change the national conversation. Beverly Batte is Chief Content Officer at Red, Wine, and Blue, and she joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
So how did Red, Wine, and Blue get started? What is your mission? What's the focus? And why primarily focus on suburban women?
Well, I think starting with the last part of that, you see the suburbs as the only swing districts in the country. You know, if you live in a city, you are a D plus 1,000. If you live in a very rural area, you are R plus 1,000. So suburbs are really those swing districts. But Red, Wine, and Blue got started in 2019 after our founder, Katie Paris, noticed that we didn't quite have the movement in Ohio that the rest of the country saw in 2018 in the midterms. So she had a mission to change that by helping women provide resources and do all kinds of things to organize on the local level.
Well, as you know, school board meetings have taken on a much larger sort of political stage, if you will. And there's been a lot of talk about whether or not these sort of things are organic, whether or not there's funding coming from organized groups that are influencing the passions, let's put it that way, that we're seeing at these meetings. So I have to ask you, who's funding your organization?
Well, since we launched Book Ban Busters, which is our campaign pushing back against these book bans, we've seen over, and that was on January 31st, about $50,000 of donations of people coming in, donating to Red, Wine, and Blue to fight back against this. So we've seen, we get a lot of donations that way, some smaller family foundations, but unlike groups like Moms for Liberty that are funded by things like the Heritage Action and groups like that, we do not have those DC ties.
So I'm fascinated by this hashtag Book Ban Busters. As you know, as you just mentioned, dozens of states are embroiled in attempts to yank what they call objectionable books. I did a little bit of this story earlier on CBS Mornings, where we showed LeVar Burton, who's beloved by everybody because he was the host of Reading Rainbow and so has an outsized influence on a lot of young people, people who were young then, who watched him on Reading Rainbow. And he was talking about a book about Rosa Parks that is being banned. Books about the Holocaust. For example, Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which is an incredible book about the Holocaust, stories that his grandfather told him about surviving concentration camps, which he then put into a comic book form. That's been banned in some school districts across the country. How are you using this movement to push back on that?
Well, we started hearing about these book bans last spring, heading into the summer. It was cloaked a lot in anti-CRT rhetoric at that time, right? We heard about that a lot. But at the end of the day, they were banning access to knowledge. And so we started seeing books like I Am Rosa Parks, books like Mouse getting banned, and outraged by parents at the local level that this was happening. Because at the end of the day, what we want is our children to have access to a good education. That's why folks move to the suburbs, right? For the schools. And so to have that, to have this kind of well-funded effort to take away the equity in our children's education is really too much to bear. And that's why you're seeing moms at bus stops across the country coming together and trying to figure out what they can do to fight back against that. So we offer things like our troublemaker training, where you can figure out how to push back against these bans, other resources, how to do pretty much everything where it comes to having to organize against this, like I said, this well-funded effort coming out of DC.
We just popped up that map that you guys have on your website, which I think is such an interesting tool. I live in Pennsylvania, and so I went, of course, to see, the state that I'm in, and I had no idea, actually, the number of mask bans that are being pushed, that have been passed, that have been thwarted. I think for a lot of parents, if you got a full-time job and you're juggling all, everything you need to do, you're not keeping track of this stuff, right? So it was very, very informative, interactive sort of map.
Can I just add to your point, Anne-Marie, about that map, Anne-Marie and Beverly? One of the things, Beverly, you said something which I think is interesting. There is a perception that you sometimes move to the suburbs because you, quote, get a better education. But as a proud product of New York City public schools, I will note that you don't have the type of book bannings here in New York City that you've seen in some of the places you've seen across the country. Right. In other words, the perception that you get a better education out in the suburbs or in some of the more rural areas is not always true, because you can get a good education in an urban public school like I did.
But to offer the flip side, the parents that are upset about these books don't think that that's the case, right? They think exposure to these books are not giving their children a better education. And one of the other topics, it's not just race, but it's also gender, LGBTQ rights. Those books as well are being there's a big pushback. And the argument is that they're not age appropriate. Why are we teaching these little kids about body parts and so on and so forth? I want to get your reaction to the people who say these sorts of books should not be made available.
It scares me to think about books not being made available, but I think what people are failing is that most of these books aren't being taught in actual classes. They're just available in the library. And so if you want to talk to your child about, hey, don't check out that book, I don't feel comfortable with it, that's your right. And that's the parent choice that the other side likes to talk about, right? They can have that conversation, and I can have the same conversation with my child. That's my responsibility. But it's important that children who might not have, every access can go and learn about what it means to be a gay person, what it means to be trans. They need to be able to see themselves reflected. And when that happens, we see better outcomes for these children, right? So I think that's really important. And it's just leading with kindness, right? It's being able to say at the end of the day that we are trying to create a kind, welcoming environment that does not foster bullies for our children to go and to learn in. And so we're really trying to lead with that, lead with love.
I thought it was really interesting that you said that, some of these books are just made available, because one of the bans in Pennsylvania was against a book just being made available, that they felt like if the children were going to be exposed to it, then they needed to be exposed to it with a teacher's guidance. That just putting it in the library and letting them just discover it on their own was bad. So they wanted the book banned from just being in the library. So the question I actually wanted to ask you is, do you think this is just about books?
No, it's absolutely not just about books. It's about destroying public education. I mean, we're seeing it with all of these different things. Sometimes it's books, sometimes it's anti-critical race theory, sometimes it's anti-trans kids in sports, anti-mask, anything that they can find that's going to be the fracture point in a community, right? To really derail public education in a time where parents are already exhausted, to your point, and are having to face things like figuring out how to get kids to school, how to make sure that they're safe, how we don't lose a bunch of teachers as we're seeing this kind of mass exodus from the profession. So we have real issues with public education that moms at the school bus stop are really talking about and really concerned about. It's not this. It's not the theater that the right is trying to bring to your local school board meeting. It's moms that are just trying to get that safe, honest education for our children.
Yeah, and when I read that, children's books about Rosa Parks were one of the books, and some of the books that were being banned. I mean, there are people who were against Rosa Parks riding on that bus, and people who supported Rosa Parks that are still alive today.
I know.
And we don't want to teach children about Rosa Parks. I find
an American hero. Yeah, I know. Beverly, Batte, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.